The bay mare arrived at Hugh Walden's fence line on a Tuesday morning in October of 1878, and the young woman riding her looked like she had not slept in 3 days. Hugh had been mending fence posts along the eastern edge of his property when he heard the slow, careful footfall of hooves on the dry Texas earth. He straightened up from where he had been crouching, a strand of barbed wire dangling from his gloved hand, and squinted against the pale autumn sun. The woman on the horse was slight and upright, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years, and she was leading the mare with a kind of deliberate care that told Hugh she was someone who had been raised to respect animals even when she was nearly dead on her feet herself. He knew the horse before he knew the woman. The bay mare was Clover, one of Hugh's best animals, a horse he had lent to Samuel Shepard 6 weeks prior when Samuel's own gelding had thrown a shoe and gone lame the same week Samuel needed to get across the county to register some land documents before the territorial deadline. Samuel Shepard was a decent man, a small farmer who worked a modest plot about 12 miles south and east of Hugh's spread, and Hugh had not given the loan a second thought. It was the kind of thing neighbors did out here in Caldwell County, Texas. You helped a man when you could, and you trusted the horse would come back. Now the horse was coming back, but Samuel Shepard was not riding her. Hugh pulled off his glove and walked toward the fence line, watching the young woman bring Clover to a stop about 10 yards out. She sat very still in the saddle for a moment, as if gathering herself, and then she dismounted with a practiced ease that told him she was comfortable around horses. She was wearing a plain brown dress, dusty from the road, with a canvas jacket over it against the morning chill, and she was carrying a worn leather saddlebag over one shoulder. She looped Clover's reins over the top fence rail and turned to face him, and Hugh Walden felt something shift inside his chest that he could not immediately name. She had dark eyes, wide and direct, and a face that was tired but honest, the kind of face that did not bother with pretense. She looked to be somewhere near his own age, which was 26, perhaps a year or two younger. There was a sadness sitting heavy behind those dark eyes, and something else too, a quiet stubbornness, the look of a person who had decided they were going to do the necessary thing no matter how hard it was. "Mr. Walden," she said. Her voice was steady, though he could hear the effort it took. "That's me," he said. "My name is Frances Shepard. Samuel Shepard was my father." She paused on the word "was," and the weight of it settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. "He passed 3 weeks ago. Fever, I have brought back your horse. She is in good health. My father took fine care of her." Hugh held her gaze for a long moment. He was not a man who spoke quickly when the moment did not call for it. He took off his other glove and tucked both of them into his belt and walked the rest of the way to the fence. He looked at Clover, who was calm and bright-eyed, and then he looked at Frances Shepard, and he thought about the 12 miles she had ridden alone, and the 3 weeks she had apparently been managing whatever had fallen apart when a man died and left his affairs behind. "I am sorry about your father," he said, and he meant it simply and completely. "Thank you," she said. She reached into the saddlebag and brought out a folded piece of paper. He kept a record of what he owed various people. He was particular about debts. "I have been working through the list. There is nothing owed for the horse, I know that, but I wanted to bring her back myself and tell you directly that we are grateful." Hugh took the paper she was offering him, though he had no idea why she was giving it to him. He unfolded it and saw it was a list in a careful hand, names and figures and dates, the meticulous accounting of a man who had not wanted to leave disorder behind him. Near the bottom was Hugh's name with the notation beside it, "Horse, borrowed in good faith to be returned with thanks." He folded the paper and held it out to her. "Keep this," he said. "It belongs to your family's records." She took it back and tucked it away without argument. She was watching him with those direct dark eyes, waiting to see what he would do next, and he had the strong impression that she had been watching a great many people these past 3 weeks, waiting to see what they would do next, and that most of them had disappointed her. "How are you managing?" he asked. Something flickered across her face, quickly controlled. "We are managing," she said. My brother Caleb is 15. He has been working the farm. I have been handling the business affairs. Hugh nodded slowly. He had been living alone on this land for 4 years since his own father had died and left it to him, and he knew something about the particular silence of a property after the person who had anchored it was gone. He knew about the way the work did not pause for grief, about the way creditors and decisions and neighbors and paperwork all kept arriving at the door regardless of how heavy the sorrow was. "Clover stays with you," he said. Frances blinked. "I beg your pardon. The horse. She stays with you." He reached out and unlooped Clover's reins from the fence rail and held them out to Frances. "Your father borrowed her because he needed to get somewhere important and his own horse was lame. You are here alone managing a farm and a 15-year-old brother. You need a reliable horse more than I need to have Clover standing in my barn." Frances stared at the reins. She did not take them right away. Hugh noticed that her hands were roughened, the hands of someone who had not had an easy few weeks, and he noticed that she was very carefully not letting her composure break, though it clearly cost her something. "That is a generous offer," she said carefully, "but we cannot accept charity." "It is not charity," Hugh said. "Your father was a good neighbor." "I am doing what a good neighbor does." He kept holding the reins out to her. "Take the horse, Miss Shepard." She looked at him for a long moment with those grave dark eyes, and then she asked very quietly, "What is the rest of it?" He had not expected that. "The rest of what?" "You said keep the horse, and there is something in the way you said it that makes me think you are going to say more. Most men who offer something like this want something in return, or they have some condition attached." "I would rather know what it is directly." Hugh Walden looked at her, and despite himself, he almost smiled. "There is no condition," he said. "There is nothing in return. I was going to ask if you would come up to the house and have some coffee, because you look like you have been riding since before dawn and you look like you have not had a hot meal in longer than that. That is the rest of it." Frances Shepard looked at him for another long moment, and then slowly, something in the rigid set of her shoulders eased just slightly, just enough for him to see that she was tired in a way that went much deeper than the road. "Coffee would be welcome," she said. He led Clover through the gate and walked beside Frances up the gradual slope toward the house, and that was how it began. Hugh Walden's house was not grand, but it was solid. His father, James Walden, had built it from limestone and cedar in 1861, before the war changed everything, and Hugh had added a front porch and a proper kitchen in the years since he had taken it over. The yard was clean, the barn in good repair, and there were 2 other horses in the paddock besides the ones he worked daily, along with a small cattle operation that was modest but steady. He settled Clover in the paddock and led Frances to the porch, where he gestured for her to sit in one of the 2 wooden chairs while he went inside to get the coffee going. She sat, and he noticed through the window that she did not slump, even when she thought no one was watching. She sat very straight, looking out across his land with the quiet attention of someone who was used to assessing the practical worth of things. He brought out 2 tin cups of coffee and a plate with some cold biscuits and a wedge of hard cheese that he had left from the day before, and he sat across from her and let the morning settle around them without rushing into words. She drank half the coffee before she spoke. "This is good land," she said. "It is," he said. "How is your land?" "It is good land too," she said, and there was both pride and worry in the way she said it. "My father knew what he was doing. He chose well 12 years ago when we came from Georgia. The soil is good. We have a fair water access from the creek." "But," Hugh said, she glanced at him, "but nothing. I said it was good land." "You said it was good land in the same way a person says the roof is not leaking when the walls are damp," Hugh said mildly. She looked at him again, sharper this time, reassessing him. "The mortgage," she said after a moment. "My father took it out 2 years ago for a new plow and some equipment. The payments are manageable, but they require a steady income, and Caleb is 15 and I am 23 and we have no hired help." "What crops?" "Cotton mostly, some corn, a kitchen garden, livestock, 2 mules, some chickens. We had a milk cow, but she died in August." Hugh nodded. He did this quietly, without dramatic sympathy, which she seemed to appreciate. Cotton will see you through if the weather holds, and Caleb is a decent worker. Caleb is an excellent worker, she said, and the firmness in her voice when she said this made Hugh think that she had probably had to say this to several people over the past few weeks who had not believed it. He is young, but he is capable, and he works without complaining. Then you will manage, Hugh said, and he said it simply as a statement of fact rather than a reassurance, and she responded to it differently than she might have responded to hollow comfort. Yes, she said, we will. They sat for a while longer, and he refilled her coffee, and she ate 2 of the biscuits and some of the cheese with the straightforward appetite of someone who had genuinely not eaten properly that morning. She asked him about Clover, how old the mare was and what her habits were, and he told her, and she listened with genuine attention, the way someone listens when they are planning to take care of something and want to do it right. When she finally rose to leave, she shook his hand, which surprised him. It was a firm handshake, brief and direct, and she thanked him for the coffee and the horse and his time, and she walked back down to the paddock and took Clover out through the gate with a calm efficiency. He stood on the porch and watched her ride south along the trail, and he stood there longer than was strictly necessary, long after she had disappeared into the low cedar scrub, and when he finally went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table with the rest of his coffee, he realized that the something that had shifted in his chest when she first turned to face him had not shifted back. 3 days later, he rode south. He told himself it was because he had a neighbor who had lost her father and was managing a farm with a 15-year-old, and that being a decent neighbor meant checking in. He had done this for other people in the county. He had helped the Martins when their barn burned, and he had ridden out to assist the Kellermans when their well caved in, and neighborliness was something he believed in as a matter of principle. He arrived at the Shepard property in the late morning to find Frances on the roof of the chicken coop with a hammer and a handful of cedar shingles, replacing what looked like storm damage along the ridge. There was a boy below her passing shingles up, and Hugh recognized immediately from the set of his jaw and the dark eyes that this was Caleb Shepard. "Mr. Walden," Frances said from the roof, not stopping what she was doing. She seemed genuinely unsurprised to see him, which he found interesting. "Miss Shepard," he said, dismounting. "What do you need?" She paused then and looked down at him. "What do I need in what sense?" "In the sense that you are on a roof when there are presumably other things that also need doing, which means you have had to prioritize, which means there are things further down the list that are not getting done." She studied him from up on the roof for a moment. "The south pasture fence needs about 40 yards of mending," she said finally, "and there is a section of the water trough that has cracked and needs patching before the first real freeze." "I can do both of those," Hugh said. Caleb Shepard looked up at his sister and then across at Hugh with the sharp, careful eyes of a boy who had been doing a man's work for 3 weeks and was not sure whether to be grateful or suspicious of an adult who showed up offering things. Hugh met the boy's gaze steadily and without performance. "Tools are in the barn," Frances said, and went back to her shingles. Hugh spent the better part of the day working on the Shepard property. Caleb came and helped with the fence mending in the afternoon, once the chicken coop roof was done, and the two of them worked in a comfortable quiet that Hugh appreciated. Caleb was, as his sister had said, capable and without complaint. He knew what he was doing with a fence post, and he listened when Hugh showed him the correct way to stretch wire so it would hold through a winter freeze. "Did you know our father?" Caleb asked at one point, straightening up and wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Not well," Hugh said honestly. "Well enough to know he was a good man who kept his word." Caleb nodded slowly. "He was," he said, and went back to work. Frances brought them water mid-afternoon and then did not linger. She was always in motion, Hugh noticed, moving from one task to the next with a methodical efficiency that was not harried but was constant. She was carrying the weight of this place, and she was carrying it without display, and he found that he respected it so much it almost ached. At the end of the day, when the fence was done and the water trough patched and the evening was coming in with a gold and copper light across the scrubland, Frances walked out to where Hugh was loading his tools back into his saddlebag. "Thank you," she said. "What do we owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "Mr. Walden," she said, with a firmness that was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. "You are going to make it very difficult for me to maintain any sense of accounting if you keep doing things for us without accepting anything in return." He finished buckling the saddlebag and turned to face her. The sunset light caught the side of her face, and he thought she was the most honestly beautiful person he had ever seen, not in a way that had anything to do with prettiness as a performance, but in the way that a good piece of country is beautiful, the way land is beautiful when it is real and unadorned and means something. "I am not keeping track," he said. "I am," she said. "I know you are," he said. "Dinner," he said then quickly, because something in him decided it was time to stop being careful. "I'm inviting myself to dinner and that makes us even." She stared at him, and then, startling both of them, she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face into something that he was not sure he could look directly at without giving himself away. "All right," she said. "Dinner. Caleb caught a rabbit this morning. I hope that is adequate." "It is more than adequate," he said. He stayed for dinner, and they sat around the small table in the kitchen of the Shepard farmhouse, the three of them, and Caleb asked Hugh questions about cattle and land and horses, smart questions that showed he had been paying attention to the world around him. And Frances cooked the rabbit with dried herbs from the kitchen garden and made cornbread, and served it all with the quiet dignity of someone who was not going to apologize for what she had, even when it was plain and simple. After dinner, Caleb excused himself to do the evening chores, and Hugh and Frances sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she poured 2 small glasses of something her father had apparently put up, a kind of peach brandy, and they sat with those glasses and talked, and Hugh could not afterward have said exactly what they talked about, only that it went on for a long time, and that it felt like something he had not had in years. The particular ease of talking to someone who was listening, not just to be polite, but because they were genuinely interested. She told him about Georgia, about coming west when she was 11, about the wagon journey that had taken 4 months, and the way Texas had looked to her the first time she saw it, enormous and gold and nothing like home. She told him about learning to ride properly, because there was no other way to get anywhere, about learning to shoot because her father had insisted all his children know how to handle a rifle, about the books she had read by lamplight through whole Texas winters, whatever could be borrowed or traded for in the nearest town. He told her about his father, who had been a methodical, quiet man with a gift for horses and a tendency to understate everything, including his own considerable skill. He told her about the 4 years since James Walden had died, about the learning curve of running land alone, about the mistakes he had made and what they had cost him and what he had eventually figured out. She listened to all of it with those dark, attentive eyes, and she asked questions that were sharp and relevant, not the polite questions people asked when they were waiting for their turn to speak, but the questions of someone who was genuinely following the thread of what you were saying and pulling on it. He left late and rode home under a sky so full of stars that the darkness was almost irrelevant, and he thought about the way she had laughed, and the way she had said we are managing with all that stubborn precision, and the way the lamplight had sat on the side of her face, and he thought that he was in considerable trouble, and he was not entirely sorry about it. He went back the following week, and the week after that. He brought things that were useful, a tool he had 2 of, some extra cedar shingles, a bag of grain for the mules, and he always contrived some reason for the giving that was practical enough to get past Frances's resistance to accepting anything she had not earned. She did not make it easy. She had a careful pride that was not vanity but something more fundamental, a deep need to be on equal footing, and Hugh found that the only way to satisfy it was to make sure the exchange went both ways. So she fed him, whenever he stayed long enough, and she mended a tear in his jacket one afternoon when she saw it, and would not hear of him leaving before it was fixed. And she gave him a jar of preserved peaches from the kitchen garden, and would not take no for an answer. And once, when his own fence line developed a problem near where it bordered her property, she and Caleb came and helped with the repair without being asked, and would not stay for the meal he tried to make them stay for. Which meant he owed her again, which seemed to be exactly how she wanted it. November came, cold and clear, and the cotton was in and the yield had been adequate enough for the mortgage payment with something left over, and Frances permitted herself exactly one small moment of visible relief when she told him this, sitting on the porch in the thin afternoon sun. "You see," he said. "I was not as worried as you think," she said. "You were precisely as worried as I think," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You are presumptuous, Mr. Walden." "Hugh," he said. He had been saying this for 2 months, and she kept calling him Mr. Walden, and he was not sure whether it was habit or something deliberate. She was quiet for a moment. "Hugh," she said finally, and something in the way she said it carefully, as if she was taking it out and holding it to the light, made his breath go somewhere unexpected. "You have been very good to us," she said then, her voice returning to its usual directness. "I want you to know that I know it and that I do not take it for granted." "I know you do not," he said. "I also want you to know," she said, looking out at the scrubland rather than at him, "that I am aware of why you keep coming." Hugh said nothing. The wind moved through the cedar trees, low and dry. "I am not certain how I feel about it yet," she said. "I am being honest with you because you have been honest with me, and that seems like the right way to proceed." "That is entirely reasonable," Hugh said. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he was not usually aware of it. "I am not in a position," she said carefully, "to think about anything beyond this farm and Caleb's future for some time. It would not be fair to you to let you think otherwise." "I am not asking you to be in any position," Hugh said. "I am asking you to let me come back." She turned and looked at him then, finally, and those dark eyes were so direct that he felt them like a physical thing. "Why?" she asked. And it was the same question she had asked him on the very first morning, standing at his fence line with Clover's reins in her hand. "What is the rest of it?" She did not accept easy answers, this woman. "Because I have not talked to anyone the way I talk to you in longer than I can remember," he said. "Because you are the most honest person I have met in years. Because being on your porch feels more like being somewhere than being in my own house does." He stopped, feeling that he had said enough, possibly more than enough. Frances looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back out at the scrubland. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Caleb wants to ask you about the cattle operation." He came back Thursday. He came back the Thursday after that, and the one after that, and somewhere in the slow accumulation of Thursdays and the other days that had gradually added themselves to the Thursday visits, something between Hugh Walden and Frances Shepard changed in the way that things change in winter, imperceptibly, and then all at once. It was December when he first noticed that she had stopped being careful with him. Not careless, Frances Shepard would never be careless. It was not in her nature, but the guard she had kept up in those first weeks, the constant careful measuring of what she said and what she showed, had quietly relaxed. She laughed more easily. She argued with him more freely, which he had come to understand was a sign of comfort in her, that she only pushed back when she was not worried about what it would cost her. She disagreed with him one evening about the best way to handle a drainage problem in the North Field, and she laid out her reasoning with such precision and such heat that he sat back and let her finish, and then said, "You are completely right," and she stared at him as if she had expected him to argue further. "I know," she said, and then she laughed, and it was the full laugh this time, the one that was not surprised out of her but just was, and he thought he had never heard anything so good in his life. Christmas came and went quietly at both places, Hugh alone at his property and Frances and Caleb at theirs, but they spent Christmas Eve together on the Shepard porch with a small fire burning in a tin barrel against the cold, and Caleb went to bed early and left the two of them out there in the dark and the cold, and Hugh was not sure whether the boy had been tactful or just tired. "It is a good night," Frances said. "It is," Hugh said. The stars were extraordinary the way they got in the Texas winter, enormous and uncountable. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled in the tin barrel. "About what you said. About your house feeling less like somewhere than my porch does." Hugh waited. "I have been thinking," she said again, more slowly, "about the fact that I have been looking forward to Thursdays in a way that I have not been looking forward to things for a long time." She paused. "For a very long time, actually." "Since before your father died," he said quietly. She nodded. "Since before that." Georgia was a long time ago, and things were difficult here for different reasons at different times, and I think I stopped expecting things to be something to look forward to and started expecting them to be things to get through. Hugh said nothing, because this did not call for words yet. "You are making things something to look forward to again," she said, very quietly, looking at the fire. "I thought you should know that." He reached across the space between their chairs very slowly and covered her hand with his. She looked down at his hand on hers, and then she turned her hand over so that his palm was resting against her palm, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking, while the stars wheeled overhead and the fire burned low, and the Texas winter settled around them with its sharp, clean cold. January brought cold, dry weather and a great deal of work on both properties, and Hugh rode over most days now rather than waiting for Thursdays, sometimes just for an hour in the mornings to see whether there was anything that needed doing before he headed back to his own work. Caleb had stopped looking at him with careful eyes and started looking at him with something that was closer to straightforward acceptance, which felt significant. One morning in late January, Hugh arrived to find Frances in the kitchen working on the farm's accounts by lamplight, the papers spread across the table with the kind of focused intensity that meant she had been at it for a while. She looked up when he came in, and she had an ink stain on her left hand and her hair was down, something he had not seen before, and he stopped in the doorway for a beat too long. "Sit down," she said, without seeming to notice. "I want to ask you something about the land lease arrangements in this county. I have been reading about them, and I think there may be a way to bring in some additional income by leasing the north field to the Hendersons for grazing, but I want to understand whether it is standard practice here." He sat down and they spent an hour going through it, Frances's pencil moving across the paper as she worked out figures, and Hugh told her what he knew about the Henderson operation and the general customs around land leasing in Caldwell County, and when they had worked it out to her satisfaction, she looked up from the paper and found him watching her. She held his gaze for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You were going to say something." "I was going to ask if I could take you to the spring social in Lockhart," he said. "It is in March. It is a community event, a dance and a gathering, and I have not gone the last 2 years because there was not anyone I wanted to go with." Frances set down her pencil very carefully. "Is that what this is?" she said. "A courtship?" "Yes," Hugh said, because she deserved the direct answer. She was very still for a moment. "We would be the subject of a considerable amount of talk," she said. "Probably," he said. "I do not particularly care about talk," she said. "I know," he said. "But Caleb is part of this," she said. "Whatever happens between you and me, Caleb is part of this, and I will not have him confused or destabilized by something that begins and then goes nowhere." "I understand," Hugh said. "I am not interested in going nowhere." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote something at the bottom of the paper, turned it around and pushed it across the table to him. He looked down at what she had written. "Spring Social, March, Lockhart." "Yes." He looked up at her. She was looking down at the papers, moving them back into order, but there was a color in her face that had not been there a moment ago. "I will pick you up at 4 o'clock, he said. 3:30, she said, without looking up. "I dislike being rushed." The spring social in Lockhart was a proper community affair. the kind of thing that the town held twice yearly to give the scattered farm and ranch families a reason to come together. There was music from a fiddle and a guitar, long tables with food brought potluck style, and a cleared area for dancing under a canvas canopy strung with lanterns. The March evening was cool but not cold, and the air smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and something that might have been hope, or perhaps that was just Hugh Walden's particular state of mind. He drove Frances and Caleb in his wagon, because it was more dignified than riding horseback for a social occasion, and he had put on his good shirt and brushed his hat. And when he arrived at the Shepard property at 3:30 precisely, Frances was standing on the porch in a dress he had not seen before, a dark blue that he thought she had probably made herself, with her hair done up properly and a different look in her eyes than usual. A look that was still direct and still honest, but that had something hopeful in it, and he had to remind himself to continue functioning normally. Caleb, for his part, was wearing a clean shirt and looked equal parts mortified and secretly pleased about the whole enterprise. The social was well attended. Hugh knew most of the people there, having lived in the county his whole life, and he made introductions where they were needed, and Frances handled those introductions with the same level-headed grace she handled everything, though he noticed she was quieter than usual in the first hour, taking the measure of the room. Ada Morrison, who ran the dry goods store in Lockhart with her husband and who had appointed herself the keeper of the county's social calendar, came to them within 15 minutes of their arrival and looked at Frances with bright, assessing eyes. "You must be Samuel Shepard's daughter," she said. "We were all sorry to hear about Samuel. He was a fine man." "He was," Frances said. "Thank you." Ada Morrison looked at Hugh and then back at Frances with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. "Well," she said, "you are in good hands, coming with Hugh Walden. He is the most reliable man in the county." She patted Hugh's arm in a proprietary way that he tolerated with the stoicism of long practice. "I am aware," Frances said, and the way she said it, dry and certain, made Hugh want to put his hand over the laugh that was building in his chest. The fiddle started up and the dancing began, the kind of simple, communal dancing that the frontier had preserved from its various homelands, and Hugh asked Frances to dance with the same directness he had been trying to use with her from the beginning, and she took his hand with the same quiet certainty she had turned her hand over in his on Christmas Eve, and they stepped out onto the cleared floor. She danced well. He had not expected her to dance badly, given that she did everything competently, but there was a surprise in the way she moved, something looser and more unguarded than she usually allowed herself, something that was not calculated competence but genuine pleasure. He felt it in the way she held his hand, and in the way she laughed when he turned her under the fiddle's quick bright notes, and he thought that this was Frances Shepard when the weight was off for a little while, and he wanted to be the person who gave her more moments like this. They danced 3 dances and then sat out 2, and she ate with appetite and talked to the farmers' wives around her with the focused attention she gave to everything, asking questions about yields and cattle and the school situation in the county with the same interest she had asked Hugh about lease arrangements. At one point he found himself standing with Bill Calderon, a rancher he knew slightly, while Frances was in conversation with the Martins, and Calderon looked across at her and said, "Sharp young woman, that Shepard girl." "Yes," Hugh said. "Shepard Farm's going to be a challenge without the old man," Calderon said, not unkindly, just practically. "She is managing it fine," Hugh said, and something in his voice apparently settled the conversation because Calderon nodded and moved on. On the way home in the wagon, Caleb fell asleep sitting up, which was an impressive feat, and Frances and Hugh rode in a companionable quiet for a while under the star-thick Texas sky. "I liked your county," she said eventually. "It is your county too," he said. "I suppose it is," she said. She was quiet for another mile or so. "I liked the dancing," she said then in a different voice, a lighter one. "I know," he said, "you were good at it." "My mother taught me," she said. "Before she died, She was from a family that took dancing seriously. She paused. I do not talk about her very often. You do not have to, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to, that is different. Another pause. Her name was Alina. She died when I was 14. She was funny and she was particular about things and she liked beautiful things, which is not always easy in this kind of life, but she found a way. You are like her, Hugh said, surprising himself. Frances looked at him. How would you know that? You find a way, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and then she looked forward at the road, and she did not say anything more for the rest of the drive. But when he handed her down from the wagon at the Shepard property and she stood in the moonlight with her hand still in his, she looked up at him and said, very quietly, "Thank you, Hugh, for all of it." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed the back of it, which was an old-fashioned gesture, and perhaps not what a more modern man would have done. But Frances Shepard was not a modern woman in the sense that the newspapers used the word. She was something older and truer, and it felt right. He felt her hand go still in his, and when he looked up she was watching him with an expression that was open in a way he had not seen before. "Come for supper Sunday," she said. "I will be here," he said. He drove home alone with Caleb asleep in the wagon bed, and when he got the boy awake enough to tell him he was home and to go inside, he stood in his own yard for a long time looking at the stars, and he thought that he was, without question, completely and irrevocably in love with Frances Shepard, and that the only remaining question was what to do about it. April arrived green and warm, which was a gift in central Texas, and the Shepard farm came alive with the work of planting. Hugh rode over most mornings, and they worked side by side, often saying little, in the easy rhythm of people who had stopped needing to fill the quiet between them with words. Caleb moved between the two of them like a planet orbiting a small sun, asking questions and absorbing information and growing, visibly and almost daily, from boy toward young man. One afternoon in the middle of April, they were working in the south field, Frances setting seeds in the furrows that Caleb was pulling with the mule, and Hugh was running a secondary furrow in the adjacent rows, and the afternoon light was long and golden and warm on the red-brown soil, and Frances straightened up from where she was bent over the row and pushed her hat back from her face and looked across the field. "I need to tell you something," she said. Hugh stopped his mule. "All right," he said. "I have been writing to a man in San Antonio," she said, "through a correspondence advertisement." Hugh was very still. "It was something I arranged before I met you," she said. "After my father died, when I was worried about the farm and Caleb's future, I thought the practical thing to do was to find a husband, and I answered a correspondence advertisement, and we have been exchanging letters since November." Caleb, Hugh noticed, had taken his mule to the far end of the field with great and sudden purpose. "I see," Hugh said. "His name is Mr. Robert Emmett," Frances said. "He is a merchant in San Antonio. His wife died 2 years ago. He seems a decent man. He has asked to visit." Hugh looked at the furrow in the dirt in front of him. "What did you tell him?" "I have not answered yet," Frances said. "I wanted to tell you first, because you deserve to know. And because I wanted to be honest with you about it, the way I try to be honest about everything." He looked up at her. She was watching him with those dark, direct eyes, and there was something painful in them, something that she was working very hard to keep controlled. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I do not know," she said. "That is the honest answer. Mr. Emmett is practical and safe. He can offer Caleb a future in a city with proper schooling. He can offer me stability." She paused. "And you," Hugh waited. "And you are here," she said. "And you are someone I have thought about every day for 6 months, and being with you feels like the most natural thing that has ever happened to me, and I do not know what to do with any of that." He got down from behind the mule and walked across the furrows toward her, and she stood very still and watched him come. He stopped about 2 feet from her, which was as close as was decent in an open field, and he looked at her. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have known it for months. I have not said it because I did not want to push you before you were ready. But you are asking me to tell you what I have, and that is what I have. I am asking you to marry me, and I am asking you to let Caleb finish his schooling in Lockhart and come to live at my property when you are ready, and I am telling you that I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing this." Frances looked at him. Her hands were at her sides and they were very still. "You are certain," she said. "I have never been more certain of anything," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the field. The mule at the far end shifted its weight and blew through its nose. "Then I will write to Mr. Emmett today," she said, "and tell him that circumstances have changed and I wish him well." Hugh breathed for the first time in what felt like several minutes. "Frances," he said. "Do not look at me like that," she said, and her voice was rough at the edges. "I am trying very hard not to cry in a field." "You can cry in a field," he said. "There is no rule against it." She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, my answer is yes." He reached out and took her hand, right there in the middle of the south field in the afternoon light, and she held it tightly. And after a moment she looked up at him and her eyes were bright, but she was not crying, because she was Frances Shepard and she had made a decision, and the decision made her clear rather than overwhelmed. "We should finish the row," she said. "We should," he agreed, and let go of her hand, and they went back to their respective mules. And Caleb, at the far end of the field, stood up very straight and began working with great energy and did not look back toward them. And Hugh thought the boy had probably heard everything and was handling it with considerable tact. They were married in June in Lockhart, at the small Methodist church that Frances had begun attending in the spring. It was a simple wedding by the standards of what the town could produce, but Frances would not hear of unnecessary expense, and Hugh did not need elaborate ritual to feel the weight and significance of what was happening. She wore white, a dress she had made herself over the course of 3 months in the evenings after the farm work was done, with careful stitching and a quality of construction that made Hugh think she had put into that dress all the care and deliberateness that she put into everything. She wore her mother's cameo brooch at the collar. She carried no flowers because she said she could not see the point of cutting things to die in your hand, but when Hugh told her this afterward, she looked at him with slight exasperation and said she had just not been able to find the right ones in the garden that morning. Ada Morrison cried. Several other women cried. Caleb stood beside Hugh as the nearest thing he had to a witness and wore his good shirt and looked simultaneously embarrassed and profoundly satisfied. The preacher was a short, earnest man named Reverend Coles, who had known Hugh's family since Hugh was a boy, and who conducted the ceremony with a warmth that was genuine rather than performed. When he came to the vows, Hugh said them to Frances directly and without the slightest hesitation, looking at her face, and she said them back to him in her clear, steady voice, and her eyes were bright but steady. And when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Hugh kissed her in the careful, public way the occasion called for, and Frances put her hand against the side of his face for just a moment, and it was the most private and tender thing he had ever felt in a public place. They went back to the Walden property, which was now the Walden Shepard property in everything but name, and Caleb moved his things into the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, and Frances's few pieces of furniture from the farmhouse were brought over and integrated with Hugh's, and the Shepard farm was leased to the Hendersons exactly as Frances had planned, the arrangement she had worked out at the kitchen table that January morning with the ink stain on her hand. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that builds a life rather than simply filling it. Hugh had been living alone long enough that having Frances in the house changed everything, not noisily but completely, the way the arrival of water in a dry creek changes the sound of a landscape. She brought order to the kitchen that was different from his order, better considered, and she brought opinions to the management of the cattle operation that were, he admitted, frequently right, and she brought herself, her particular warm, difficult, wonderful self, into the center of his days, and he could not imagine how he had spent 4 years without her. She was not always easy. She was stubborn in ways that occasionally drove him to distraction, and she had a tendency to take on too much without telling him, so that he would arrive home to find she had spent the afternoon on something that would have been faster with two people, and had not thought to ask or wait. He told her this, more than once, with the directness she had always responded to, and she heard it with equal directness, and said that it was a habit she was working on and that she was not always going to get it right. And she held her ground on things she believed, which was not easy and was not comfortable, and was something he had loved in her before he married her and continued to love in her after, even when it was pointed at him. But the evenings were something Hugh Walden would not have traded for anything the world had to offer. The two of them sitting on the porch after supper while the Texas dark came in, talking or reading or sitting in that particular silence that is not emptiness but fullness, the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. She read everything she could get her hands on. He had more books than she had expected, and she worked through them with the appetite she brought to everything, and she talked about what she read with an engaged intelligence that made him want to go out and find her more books just to see what she would say about them. Caleb turned 16 that summer and grew 3 inches, which seemed medically improbable, and began talking about the possibility of attending the agricultural college in College Station when the time came, which was 2 years away. Frances had said from the beginning that Caleb would have a proper education, and she had not wavered from this in the slightest, and Hugh had agreed and meant it, and together they made careful plans toward it. The ranch grew in the first year of their marriage, modestly but steadily. Hugh added 12 head of cattle in the spring, and the fall brought a good yield from the leased farmland, and Frances negotiated a better terms with the Henderson family for the second year of the lease with the same precision she brought to anything involving numbers. By the following spring, in 1880, Frances was pregnant. She told Hugh on a Tuesday morning in March, in the kitchen over coffee, with the same directness she had brought to every significant conversation they had ever had. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment, and then he got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and put his arms around her from behind and held her, and she put her hands over his and held them against her middle. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am also very early, so I am not telling anyone else yet." "Your call," he said. "Hugh," she said after a moment. "Yes. I want you to know that this is not something I thought I would want as much as I want it," she said. "I thought I would be practical about it, the way I try to be practical about things, but I am not particularly practical about this." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Neither am I," he said. She laughed softly. "Good," she said. She told Caleb when she was further along and showing, and Caleb took the news with the expression of someone who was trying to appear casual and completely failing to conceal his delight. He asked very seriously whether Hugh thought a boy or a girl would be more useful on the ranch, and Hugh said that was entirely the wrong question, and that either would be welcome, and that Caleb's job was to be a decent brother or sister regardless. Frances watched this exchange with a look on her face that Hugh caught and would carry with him for the rest of his life, a look of such whole and uncomplicated happiness that it seemed to light the room from within. The summer of 1880 was hot, as Texas summers were, and Frances continued working through it with modifications to her usual pace that she accepted without complaint but without pretense. She was tired, and she said so. And when the heat was heavy, she sat in the shade of the porch with a book and did not feel guilty about it, which was a kind of grace in her that Hugh had been cultivating since the first winter of their marriage. He hired a hand that summer, a quiet young man named Thomas Rays, who had been working for the Calderon Ranch and wanted to be closer to Lockhart where his family lived. Thomas was good with cattle and did not require a great deal of direction, and was respectful of Frances in the straightforward way she commanded from people without effort. In late September of 1880, Frances Walden, born Frances Shepard, gave birth to a boy. He was born at the farm in their bedroom with the help of Mrs. Clara Patterson, who was the nearest thing Caldwell County had to a midwife, and who had brought approximately 40 children into the world by her own count. The birth was long and difficult in the way that first births often were, and Hugh spent most of it in the kitchen being of absolutely no use and knowing it. And when Clara Patterson finally opened the bedroom door and told him to come in, he crossed the room in 2 strides. Frances was exhausted and pale and very much herself. She was holding the baby with the careful attentiveness of someone learning the weight and territory of a new thing, and she looked up at Hugh when he came to the side of the bed, and there was on her face an expression that he had no word for, something vast and soft and awake. "He is very certain about things already," she said. "You can tell." Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and dark-haired and was gripping Frances's finger with a seriousness that did suggest strong opinions. He looked at Frances, and he thought of all the Tuesdays and Thursdays and all the evenings on the porch and all the conversations in all the lamplight, and he thought of the morning she had ridden up to his fence line on Clover with 3 weeks of grief and a list of her father's debts and too much pride for her own good, and he thought that he had never deserved anything as much as this moment, and he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve it anyway. "What do we name him?" he said. "Samuel," she said without hesitation. "Samuel James Walden, your father and mine." He had to look away for a moment at the wall at the window where the September light was coming in golden and warm. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." Caleb was allowed in shortly after, and he looked at the baby with an expression of profound seriousness, like a man examining a very significant piece of land. And then he said, "He is quite small." And Frances said, "He will not stay that way." And Caleb nodded as if this was useful information, and then reached out one careful finger and let the baby grip it. And the expression on Caleb's face shifted into something younger and less constructed. Clara Patterson left them with instructions and a list of things to watch for, and Thomas Ray's announced from the yard that he had done the evening chores without being asked, and that they were not to worry about the cattle. And then the house settled into a quiet that was different from any quiet it had held before, a quiet with weight and warmth at the center of it. Samuel James Walden was a sturdy baby and an opinionated one, which surprised no one who knew his mother. He had Frances's dark eyes and Hugh's build, which was broad and solid, and from very early on he had a look of fixed intention that made Thomas Ray's say once, with genuine admiration, that the boy would either run a ranch or run a country, and possibly both. The years that followed the birth of Samuel were years of building, not dramatically, not in the ways the dime novels told it, with gunfights and outlaws and desperate stands in burning towns, though the frontier was not without its dangers, and there was trouble enough in the county. A bad drought in 1881 that tested everyone. A dispute over water rights with a larger operation to the west that required Hugh to spend 6 weeks in a legal process that Frances navigated with more clarity than the lawyer they briefly consulted. A cattle sickness in 1882 that cost them 8 head, but was contained by Thomas's vigilance before it spread further. Through all of it, the ranch grew. Not explosively, but with the honest growth of a well-managed operation. Hugh added land in 1882, a parcel to the north that came available when a family named Kessler decided to move further west, and Frances managed the books on the expanded operation with the same precision she had brought to her father's debt ledger on the morning she first rode up to Hugh's fence line. Caleb left for College Station in the fall of 1882, which was the right time and the right decision, and still took a piece out of Frances in the way that the departure of the people you have held together always does. She saw him off with dry eyes and a basket of food for the road, and a list of practical instructions that she had clearly been composing in her head for months. He wrote to them regularly and came home for Christmas and was, by all accounts, doing well. In 1883, Frances told Hugh she was expecting again. This time she told him at the end of a working day, standing in the yard between the house and the barn in the blue evening light, and there was none of the contained uncertainty of the first time, just a directness and a quiet joy. "When?" he said. "Spring," she said. "March or April, Mrs. Patterson thinks." He pulled her to him, right there in the yard, which was not something they often did in the open, both of them being people who kept their private expressions private. She let herself be held, her face against his chest, her hands at his sides, and they stood there while the evening light went from blue to indigo and the first stars came out. "Frances," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy?" She was quiet for a moment. He felt her take a breath, the kind of breath that is actually the preceding breath to an honest answer rather than a quick one. "I am happy in a way I did not know was possible for me," she said. "I thought for a long time that the life I was going to have was a practical life, a managing life. A life where I kept things together and made sure other people were all right and did not ask for more than the work could give." He said nothing. "You are more than the work can give," she said. "You have been from the beginning. I am still not entirely used to it." She paused. "But yes, I am happy." He held her tighter for a moment and she let him. The second child was born in April of 1884, a girl this time, arriving in the spring the way spring things do, with a kind of insistence and warmth. They named her Alina, for Frances's mother, and she had Hugh's brown eyes and Frances's dark hair, and a disposition that was curious and sunny in a way that balanced the serious intensity of her older brother. Samuel was 3 when Alina arrived, and his initial response to her was dignified suspicion, followed by a gradual and eventually wholehearted adoption of the project of looking after her, which expressed itself in a 4-year-old's terms as following her everywhere and trying to explain things to her at length whether she wanted the explanation or not. Frances watched this from the porch one afternoon, Samuel crouching over Alina where she lay on a blanket in the yard, and telling her something very serious about the nature of the horse in the paddock nearby. And she laughed in the way she had laughed that very first time, surprised and real. And Hugh, who was coming from the barn, heard it from 40 feet away and stopped walking just to listen. Caleb came home for the summer of 1884 and met his niece with the grave dignity of a young man of 19 who was 2 years into a serious agricultural education and had thoughts about crop rotation and water management and land use that he delivered to Hugh with an earnestness that made Hugh genuinely glad to listen. He was going to be a fine man, Caleb Shepard. He already was. The town of Lockhart was growing through the 1880s as the railroad came closer to central Texas, and the economy of the region shifted and expanded. Hugh watched the growth with the thoughtful attention of a man who had been on this land long enough to see multiple versions of the same country, and understood that the version you were in was always temporary. He talked to Frances about it on the porch evenings, about what the railroad would mean for cattle prices and land values, and the future of small operations like theirs. Frances listened to all of it and then said, "We should expand the herd before the railroad comes, while the land for grazing is still accessible and reasonably priced, and then we will be positioned to take advantage of the shipping access when it arrives rather than scrambling after it." Hugh looked at her. "I was going to say the same thing." "I know you were," she said. "I said it faster." He had known, from the first morning she rode up to his fence line, that she was smarter than any situation she found herself in. He had never stopped knowing it. They expanded the herd in 1885 and again in 1886, and they were right about the railroad. And by 1887, the Walden Ranch was a solidly profitable operation that employed Thomas Rays and 2 other hands, and was known in the county as a well-run, honest outfit where a man's work was respected and fairly paid. Hugh was 35 by then and Frances 32, and they had been married 9 years, and the ranch was not the same ranch it had been when he first worked it alone after his father died, and the house was not the same house. It had been added to and improved and was full of children and books, and the particular warm complexity of a life that was well lived and honestly made. Caleb finished his course at College Station in 1886 and returned to Texas, not to Lockhart, but to a position with a land management operation in Abilene that he had secured through his own determination and the contacts he had made during his studies. He came to tell them about it in person, sitting at the Walden kitchen table with coffee and some of Frances's biscuits, and he explained the opportunity with the focused precision that was entirely his sister's in the set of his jaw and the careful choice of his words. Frances listened to all of it with her hands around her coffee cup and then said, "Is this what you want or what seems practical?" Caleb looked at her. "Both," he said. "Then go," she said, "and write." "I will write," he said. He shook Hugh's hand and Frances walked him to his horse, and they stood in the yard for a moment. The sister who had kept the farm running after their father died, and the brother who had been 15 and was now 21 and going out into the world. And Hugh watched from the porch as Frances put her hand on Caleb's arm and said something he could not hear. And Caleb nodded and then pulled her into a brief, tight embrace. And then he mounted and rode north. And Frances stood in the yard watching him go. Hugh came down from the porch and stood beside her. She was not crying. She would cry later privately in the evening when the house was quiet, and she would let him hold her then without comment because that was what they did. They let each other be what they needed to be without making it into a performance. "He is going to be extraordinary," Hugh said. "I know," she said. She turned and looked at him. "We all are." He laughed and she let herself smile and they went back inside. The years after Caleb's departure were years of a different kind of fullness. Samuel grew towards 7, 8, 9, with an intensity of purpose that expressed itself in a passionate interest in horses that had come from nowhere apparent, and settled in him like a vocation. He was already more comfortable in the saddle than most adults in the county, and Hugh began teaching him in earnest when he was 8, the real lessons, not just how to ride but how to read a horse, how to understand what an animal was telling you, how to be worth trusting from a horse's perspective. Frances watched Samuel with Clover one afternoon, Clover who was older now and slower but still sound, and Samuel was brushing her with the meticulous attention of a boy doing something he loved, and Frances said to Hugh, standing beside her at the paddock fence, "My father would have loved this." "He would," Hugh said. "He would have liked you," she said. "He was particular about people, but he liked people who were straight with him, and you are the most straight person I know." "Your father was the reason any of this happened," Hugh said. "He needed a horse to borrow, and his daughter brought it back." Frances looked at him with those dark eyes that had not changed, not once, in all the years he had been looking into them. "And then you told me to keep the horse. And then you asked what the rest of it was," he said. She smiled, which was a smile he had catalogued and kept, every version of it across all these years. "I always have to know the rest of it." "I know," he said. "I told you, did I not?" "You told me," she agreed. He reached over the fence rail and took her hand, and she turned it the same way she had turned it that Christmas Eve on the porch, so his palm was against hers. Eleanor came around the corner of the barn at a gallop, which was at 5 years old her preferred mode of locomotion, chased by the younger of the 2 ranch dogs, a spotted hound named General who had no military qualities whatsoever, and she was laughing in the full-throated way of a child who has not yet learned to modulate her delight, and the sound of it came across the yard like something thrown into water. Samuel looked up from grooming Clover and addressed his sister with the gravity of a 9-year-old who takes his responsibilities seriously. "Eleanor, do not run by the horses." "General started it," Eleanor said reasonably. Hugh squeezed Frances's hand and she squeezed back. In the spring of 1889, Frances told Hugh she was expecting a 3rd child, and she told him in the kitchen again, as she had told him about Samuel, over coffee, with the same directness she had always brought to the things that mattered most. She was 34 and he was 37 and they had been married 11 years, and the news arrived not as a surprise but as a kind of gift, an unexpected addition to something that was already whole. The 3rd child, born in November of 1889, was another boy, and they named him James, for Hugh's father, which was a thing Hugh had to take a moment in the hallway to recover from when Frances suggested it. James Walden was born in the same bedroom as his brother and sister, attended by Mrs. Clara Patterson, who was still bringing children into the world and still had opinions about it, and he arrived, according to Mrs. Patterson, in the easiest manner she had seen in years, as if he had decided the process should be efficient. Frances held him with the sureness of an experienced mother, and Hugh held him with the still-renewed wonder of a man who had not managed to become casual about the arrival of new people in his life. Samuel was 9 when James was born and treated his new brother with the comprehensive responsibility he brought to everything. And Alina was 5 and alternated between complete fascination and mild jealousy, and eventually settled into the role of the child who explained things to James in a running monologue that lasted, by varying accounts, through most of his infancy. The ranch at the end of the 1880s was a different animal from what it had been in 1878, when Frances had first ridden up to the fence line on Clover. It was a real operation now, with a reputation in the county, with established relationships with buyers who had come to trust the quality of the Walden cattle, with land that was well managed and improving year by year. Thomas Rays had been with them more than 9 years and had a place on the property that was as much home as employment, and the 2 other hands changed occasionally, but were always carefully chosen by a process that Frances and Hugh had developed together, where Frances talked to the man for 20 minutes and then told Hugh what she thought, and they found that between them they were very rarely wrong about people. The house itself had grown as well, extended to accommodate the children and the life that kept expanding. There was a proper parlor now, with Frances's books lining one wall and a comfortable settee that she read on in the evenings, and there was a room that served as a study where Hugh kept his ranch accounts, and Frances kept hers, sitting side by side at the broad table he had made one winter when the ranch work was slow, and he needed something to do with his hands. In 1890, Hugh turned 38 and Frances 35, and they stood together on the porch on a Sunday morning in autumn with coffee, the same ritual they had maintained since the early days of their marriage, and they watched the land change with the season. The Texas fall was extraordinary, the light going golden and slant, the air thinning to something crisp and clean. "I want to tell you something," Frances said. "All right," Hugh said. "I have been thinking about the early days. After my father died, when I came to your fence line with Clover, and I was so tired and so proud and so entirely certain that I was going to manage everything alone and not need anyone." "I remember," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "Not about managing. I can manage. I have always been able to manage, but I was wrong about alone." She was looking out at the land, but he could see the side of her face, the profile of her that he knew the way he knew his own hands. "I did not know what it was to not be alone in the way that matters. I had Caleb, I had the farm, I had my own conviction, which was considerable." She paused. "I did not know about this kind." "Neither did I," he said. She turned and looked at him. 12 years of marriage and those dark eyes had not lost an ounce of their directness. If anything, they had deepened the way good land deepens when it is properly tended. "Do you know what I thought," she said, "when you told me to keep the horse?" "What?" He said, "I thought, here is a man who does not need me to earn what he gives. I had been earning everything all my life." And there was something very frightening about that, and also something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like solid ground. He set his coffee down on the railing and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, which was a thing she did now without thinking about it, without calculating the cost of it, and the weight of her against his side was the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing in his life. "You are my solid ground," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "We are each other's," she said. Samuel came out of the barn at that moment leading a young horse he had been working with all week, a gray colt that the boy was gentling with a patience that was older than his years, and he moved across the yard with the animal in the long morning light, and from inside the house they could hear Alina's voice. Not the words, but the cadence of it, explaining something to her younger brother James with great and unsolicited authority. And the normal sound of the Walden household rose around them on the cool October air. Frances picked up her coffee again. "Samuel is going to be extraordinary with horses," she said, in a different voice, the practical voice she could shift to in an instant, the voice of someone who was always, even in the middle of tenderness, thinking about the work ahead. "He is," Hugh said, "better than me already." "Better than most people I have ever seen," Frances said. "He has a gift." "He has your focus and my love of horses," Hugh said. Frances considered this. "That is a fair accounting," she said. The autumn went on and the work went on, and the evenings continued to be what they had always been, full and warm, the children growing and changing and becoming, and Caleb writing from Abilene, where he had made a name for himself in land management, and was, in his last letter, mentioning a young woman named Margaret with the elaborately casual tone of someone trying not to seem as interested as he was. Frances had read that letter twice and then handed it to Hugh with an expression of barely suppressed delight, and said, "He is attempting not to mention her at all and is only talking about her." Hugh read the relevant passage and agreed. Caleb visited at Christmas of 1890 and brought Margaret, who was a calm and sensible young woman from a farming family in Taylor County, and she and Frances sat together after dinner and talked for 2 hours about things Hugh could not from the parlor quite hear, but the sound of which was the sound of two people who were going to get along very well. Caleb married Margaret in the spring of 1891 in a ceremony in Abilene, and Frances wore the best of her dresses and Hugh wore his good suit, and they made the 3-day trip by train, because the railroad had come, as they had known it would, and taken the world with it. Standing in the church watching Caleb at the altar, Frances put her hand through Hugh's arm and held it, and Hugh covered her hand with his in the way he had covered it that Christmas Eve on her porch 16 years before, and she pressed his hand once, hard, and he understood everything she meant by it. By the mid-1890s, the Walden Ranch was among the better-established operations in Caldwell County, not the largest and not the wealthiest, but well-regarded and well-run and honest in its dealing, which was a reputation worth more than size in the long term. Hugh was 40-something and Frances approaching it, and the children were grown and growing, Samuel 17, and focused on horses with a seriousness that had led to his first real success training a horse for a neighboring rancher that year, Eleanor 12, and with her grandmother Eleanor's love of beautiful things and her mother's sharp practical mind in remarkable combination, and James 7, and still being comprehensively explained to by his sister whether he wanted it or not. Clover was old by then, the mare that had started everything, and she was kept in the paddock in easy retirement, taken out for gentle walking some mornings by whichever of the children happened to be nearest. She was a steady old animal, calm and sure-footed in her age as she had been in her youth, and Frances would sometimes stand at the paddock fence and look at her with an expression that was hard to read from the outside, but that Hugh, who had learned to read Frances Shepard Walden across 17 years, understood completely. One evening he came to stand beside her at the fence while Clover moved slowly across the paddock in the low golden light. "I think about that morning," Hugh said. "I know you do," Frances said. "So do I. You looked like you were going to fall over from tiredness and pride," he said. "I was tired," she said. "The pride is ongoing," he laughed. She smiled, that smile he knew every version of. "I am grateful every day," she said quietly, "that you told me to keep the horse." "I am grateful every day," he said, "that you asked what the rest of it was." She looked at him then sideways with those dark, direct eyes that the years had not changed 1 degree. "I always have to know the rest of it," she said, which was what she had said on their porch that day, all those years ago, and it meant the same thing now that it had meant then, which was that she did not accept easy answers, and she was not going to stop asking, and she expected to be told the truth. "And the rest of it," Hugh Walden said, is that I have been in love with you since the morning you rode up to my fence and handed me a folded piece of paper and shook my hand like you were conducting a business transaction, and that I intend to be in love with you for every year I have left, and that this land and this life and all the people in it are everything I never thought to ask for and everything I want." Frances was quiet for a moment. The evening light moved across the paddock. Clover lifted her head and looked at them with the calm, unimpressed attention of an old horse who has seen a great deal. "That is a very good rest," Frances said. "I thought so," he said. She put her hand in his. He held it the way he had always held it, palm to palm, and they stood together at the paddock fence in the long Texas evening, while the land they had built their life on turned gold around them. And the house behind them was full of children and books, and the residue of work and supper. And somewhere far north in Abilene, Caleb Shepard was building his own life. And in the house Eleanor was probably explaining something at length to James, and everything that was supposed to happen had happened. And everything that was still ahead was full of the particular promise of a life that had been chosen deliberately and tended with care. The stars came out over the Walden Ranch the way they came out every clear night in central Texas, enormous and uncountable, the same stars that had hung over the fence line on an October morning in 1878, when a tired young woman with too much pride and a borrowed horse had asked a man what the rest of it was, and he had told her. Samuel married in 1898, a rancher's daughter from the next county named Ruth, who shared his gift for horses and his capacity for silence, which was not his mother's silence but his father's, the silence of a person who is comfortable in the world around them. He established his own horse operation on a parcel adjoining the Walden Ranch that Hugh and Frances helped him acquire, and the sound of that operation in the mornings, the horses moving and Samuel's voice calm and low among them, became part of the texture of the Walden Ranch's days. Eleanor went east for school in 1897, something Frances had insisted upon and saved for with the same methodical determination she brought to everything, and came back 2 years later with a degree and a very particular set of opinions about land reform and education in rural Texas that she aired at every family dinner with her mother's precision and her own considerable force. And Hugh sat at the head of the table through these discussions with the expression of a man who is profoundly satisfied with his family. James grew into a quiet, steady young man who had his father's reliability and his mother's eye for what needed doing, and he took over much of the day-to-day ranch management in the early years of the new century, while Hugh was still vigorous, but glad to have someone he trusted absolutely to hand things to. Caleb and Margaret had 3 children in Abilene, and the family gathered at Christmas when the trains made it possible. And the Walden house at Christmas was the kind of house that Christmas was invented for, full and warm and loud in a good way, with a fire in the hearth and Frances's best cooking and the accumulated warmth of people who had chosen each other in every sense. Hugh Walden, in the fullness of those years, often thought about what his life would have been without the particular sequence of events that had brought Frances Shepard to his fence line. A decent life, probably. A useful life. A life of honest work and reasonable satisfaction. But not this life. Not this particular abundance of specific and irreplaceable things. Not these children and this woman and these evenings, and the way the lamplight fell on her face when she was reading, and the way she laughed when something surprised her, and the way she held his hand, palm to palm, every time. He was grateful for the horse. He was grateful for the drought that had made a horse necessary. He was grateful for Samuel Shepard, who had been a decent man who kept his debts, and raised a daughter who kept them too. He was grateful for the October morning, the pale autumn sun, the particular way Frances had looked at him when she turned to face him for the first time at his fence line, already tired and already proud and already, without knowing it, already on her way to him. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1903, Hugh and Frances sat on the porch they had sat on for 25 years of marriages, with coffee, watching the land they had built together come into the light of a morning that was green and fresh after rain. And the ranch was quiet in the particular Sunday way it had. And from somewhere in the paddock came the sound of a horse moving slowly through the wet grass. Frances had gray in her dark hair now, and Hugh's face had the lines of a man who had spent his life outdoors and thought hard about things that mattered. And they were not old, not yet, but they were past the middle of the story and into the part where you could see both ends clearly enough to understand what it meant. "What are you thinking?" Frances asked, which was a question she asked him rarely, only when she genuinely wanted to know. "I am thinking," Hugh said, "that if you had not asked what the rest of it was, I might have let you leave." She looked at him. "You would not have," she said with certainty. "No," he admitted, "probably not." "You would have followed me," she said. "You would have ridden south and found some reason to appear at my fence line." "I did ride south 3 days later," he said. "I know," she said. "I was watching for you." He looked at her. "Were you?" She met his gaze with those eyes that had been looking at him directly for 25 years and would look at him that way for every year that remained. "From the morning you told me to keep the horse," she said, "I was watching for you." He took her hand on the arm of her chair, and she turned it, palm up, and he rested his palm against hers, and the spring morning opened around them, green and full of light, and the ranch moved into its Sunday with the quiet industry of a thing that was alive and well and built to last. And Hugh Walden held his wife's hand in the good morning air and thought that there was not a single thing he would have changed. Not the fence post he had been mending when he heard the hoofbeats. Not the moment he had looked up against the pale October sun. Not the first sight of her, dusty and upright and impossible to look away from. Not the horse. Not any of it. The rest of it had been exactly right.